Okay, so I'm a history professor. I teach history at Ferris, and I've been teaching history for about 15 years now. I've been the lead faculty for the Museum of Sexist Objects since 2013. That's when I first started working with students to organize the objects and put them into categories. And I've also been working with about 7 fellow faculty and staff to organize everything in the museum and to facilitate tours. So since we opened officially in 2015, we have had about 3,000 people come through. Now, most of our visitors are students because we are a university museum. And when we arranged all of our objects, there's a number of objects that could fit in any number of categories. So when you come through, when you do get a chance to come through in person, you'll notice that, say, a Barbie doll can fit into a number of different categories. So in order to give you a little bit of an overview, since I can't really show you the museum very successfully via Zoom, I'm going to start a PowerPoint now and give you a window into what themes we explore in the museum. Can everybody see this? Okay, good. Okay, so you'll see here the title, the first talk I'm going to give today, there's actually 2 back-to-back. The first is about the museum itself, and the question is, 100 years later, how far have we come? The museum, again, was created in the 21st century, but there is a long history of sexism in our country and indeed in the world as a whole. Actually, it wasn't until the period of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, that with the birth of the idea of citizenship, that women were first able to really articulate why they should be able to be full members of a society. Okay, so you'll see here, Museum of Sexist Objects at Ferris State University. The woman with her tongue nailed to the table, that is from the period of the anti-suffrage movement. So this is from first wave feminism. And this theme that you see relates to silencing women. You'll see here's our silencing women case. And a lot of these images, so there's our lady right there, who's our mascot. And then a couple of these other images are from the suffrage movement. So the idea is that women should be silenced. And a lot of the objects in our museum actually relate to silencing. Let's go back to our tagline. So when we were created 2014 and then opened in 2015, we wanted to emphasize that we weren't displaying sexist objects to perpetuate sexism, that we wanted to challenge sexism. And so by holding up objects like this doll, this Bratz doll, or a makeup kit, and to look at them with fresh eyes. Okay, so why is it that we are seeing women portrayed as animals, for example? And that's the sort of question you can put out to our visitors, and they can start to think about, well, what other animal images do we see with women? One image in particular, let me come down to our mission statement. And you can see here too in our mission statement that we have 3 different purposes. We'd like to raise awareness. So, you know, by putting these objects on display, a lot of times when we are exposed to sexist objects around us, we see one thing at, say, a bar one day. We go to the store, we see something else the next day. And by putting everything into one space, you can start to see how there are connections amongst them. And it's to the point where, you know, where we who work in the museum sometimes we have to work in the museum for most years at a time before we are able to make some connections. So for example, the silencing women case that I showed you earlier, that idea was actually a student's idea. She noticed as she was accessioning the objects, so in other words, researching them, that a lot of the themes had to deal with silencing. And you can see here, as far as women as animals, This is an ad, an old style ad for legs pants from the pre-second wave feminism time period, so pre-1970s, which shows a woman, being a conquered beast. So she's a conquest, and she knows her place, right? She's under the heel of a man. And so this, I wanted to put this, I asked Deb for this picture. This is when the AAUW people came to visit last October. And why I wanted you to have this picture is so you can see the space that we're in. It's really only the size of a classroom. It's a fairly small space. And so it can be very claustrophobic feeling when you're in here. You can feel overwhelmed by everything in the museum. But it also makes it possible to make connections between, for example, on the back wall, where the "Don't Grab on Me" sign is, you can see there's some toys. So you can make connections between the toys on the back wall, and then the case next over, there's a case called Happy Housewife, and so you can see how the toys that kids play with condition them to want to be happy housewives. And then, anyways, I'll keep on so you really can't see the cases in this picture. A couple other things though to notice is that everyone's holding signs from various women's marches since 2017. Pay attention to them because they'll come back later in the presentation. Okay, we already talked about the Silencing Women case and how that came out of a student, that student inspired. So when we look at how this museum functions, it's not just about sexism, essentially, it's also about racism and classism too. So it's intersectional, it's intergenerational because of our work with our students, and it's also cross-disciplinary because of all the different people at our university who work in the museum. We have sociologists who work with us, we have math professors, language and literature professors, social work professors as well. So everyone brings their own perspective to the museum. I'm a historian, so I take that perspective, but there are many other ways to approach the objects in the room, and really without the other perspectives, you don't get the full picture of how sexism operates in our society. Okay, so when we created the objects and to exhibit categories, I put Silencing Women first, but there's some other themes there too that we found a lot of objects that fit under them. For example, the perfect body, women of color, women in leadership really made an impression on the AAUW group when they came to visit us in October. Women as animals, ugly women, violence against women, then various caricatures and stereotypes of women, such as the good girl, the bad girl. You can find a number of stereotypes in here related to gold digging, as well as wife, mother stereotypes, stepmothers, mother-in-law, and then also feminism and anti-feminism. So this is a picture of the perfect body case, which is on the right-hand side as you walk into the museum. And here are a few close-ups. The reason I put the corset here is because if you look at the long history of humankind, our ideal of a perfect female body changes all the time. And the corset, which is something we would associate more with the 19th century, is actually back again if you follow the Kardashians or if you have any children or grandchildren who follow the Kardashians. The objects to the right of the corset are plastic surgery implements. And we don't have them labeled in the museum. They just are sitting there in the same case with all these beautiful, socially decided, who's beautiful and who's not. So a lot of the women in that case are white and they're blonde, and they have, it's pretty clear they've been working out. But we put this in because of a TV show that was very popular in the 90s called The Swan. And the idea behind the TV show was that women who were ugly ducklings would be chosen and given the opportunity to be made beautiful. But in the process, they had to undergo all this terrible, in my mind, terrible, painful plastic surgery in order to achieve this beauty ideal. So we have those in the case just to show people the high price that women pay for beauty and are willing to pay for beauty. The next case, I mentioned it before, is called The Games We Play. So you can see in that case a lot of games that relate to gender norming. So what should little boys be like? What should little girls be like? So it definitely ties into the Happy Housewife case. And what I find really interesting, if you look at the bottom right hand of this picture, you'll see there's a Minnie's Playhouse kitchen. What's interesting about that is there's really nothing gendered about that kitchen. It does say Minnie, but most of the kids who would be playing with that kitchen would be not really reading yet. There's another kitchen that we have in this same exhibit that's pink and purple and very traditionally girly looking. And that kitchen is from the 1990s. So I think a lot of times we get this idea that we are making progress, right? Same thing with corsetting. Corsetting, corsets were a problem in the past. Now women don't wear corsets, but oh, whoa, now corsetting is popular again. The same thing with the toys. You might get the idea that we've made progress, but a lot of times sexism is very interesting that way, and that it keeps coming up in different forms, but oftentimes the same theme. So that's why historical perspective is a good one to have in the museum. The women of color case is an example of just how intersectional our museum can be. So this includes women, African-American women, Native American women. A lot of the objects in our museum are actually donated by visitors. So people come through and they say, oh my goodness, my aunt has something in her attic. I just found something at the store the other day. For example, the kitchen squaw, which you can see right in the middle of the middle case, was donated by a friend of ours who lives out in Los Angeles. So that ties together, domesticity, otherness, and think about the Aunt Jemima stereotype, the mammy stereotype in the Jim Crow Museum, for example, and it can come out again with as it intersects with sexism. So basically, for women of color, they're experiencing a double jeopardy of both racism and sexism. And so to the point of the long history of objectification of not just, of course, all women, but when you look at African and African-American women, this is a story that I like to tell in the museum because it shows the history of imperialism, sexism, and racism. This is the Sarah Bartman story, and she was actually a very early case of human trafficking. She was trafficked from South Africa to England and then later France, where she was actually put on display because of her unusual anatomy. So her body was actually, a mold was made of her body, and so even after she died, people could come and look at her as an unusual African example of femaleness. And she actually ended up dying very young in Europe, and was only, and her skeleton was put on display for over a century after her death. And it was only recently that she was repatriated to South Africa and buried there. So this is an extreme example of objectification of a woman. So, it's not good to be a woman of color, nor is it good to want education. We have the Is College Bad for Girls object is actually in our Women in Leadership case. And if you could read it, it's hard to see. It talks about how basically going to college for women, and I know a lot of AAUW women, of course, you've gone to college, and there's the idea that you're going to lose your femininity, you're going to lose your virtue, who knows what you're doing because you're outside of the control of your parents, you're not married yet. So there's an anxiety about sending your daughters to college. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the club woman. And this is probably the oldest object that we have in the museum. And this is related to first wave feminism. So this is an anti-suffrage message. And you'll notice that this is a woman who's, not in the home, not the happy housewife. She has Robert's Rule of Order open in her hand, and she is a club woman. So this postcard is basically making fun of her and telling her that she ought to go home and tend her babies because that's what real women do. She has to be ashamed of herself because she's godless. She's a joke. So, in order to organize for suffrage, women had to leave their houses and go and meet with other women and give speeches. Any of you who've read the Anna Howard Shaw books, either the biography or the autobiography, know that she spent a lot of time on the road. And so you can see here the official anxiety that society had with women stepping out of their, outside of their domain, outside of their sphere. So overeducated women were dangerous. And that can be something we'll talk about later when I take questions. Okay, so here is the women in leadership case. And this is probably one of our most confusing cases in the museum because it has positive messages and negative messages all together. So there are, you can't see it here in this picture, but we have fairly positive messages about, there's a Hillary coloring book, for example, Barbara Walters. You can see an AAUW Outlook right there because I used to get those when they were still being produced. A bobblehead for Michelle Obama, for Condi Rice. There's a Moose Burger Helper, which is negative about Sarah Palin, but then we also have a bobblehead related to her. There's a sisterhood mug there related to the Women's March in 2017. There's a Perfect Wife book, which also relates to the wife case next to it, related to Barbara, not Barbara Bush, but to Laura Bush. And right in the middle there, you'll see a handmade, basically a little stitching made in honor of Anna Howard Shaw, who's one of our local suffragists here in Big Rapids, the most famous of them. But beneath that, you can see some fairly negative messaging related to Hillary Clinton from when she was First Lady. It says, fire Hillary, the health care, it's the B word. There's also an image of Hillary also looking masculine with actual male genitalia. So if you relate that to the club woman, you can see that a woman who wants to step outside of the wife role can be portrayed as masculine. So that's a way to demean her, is to say that she really just wants to be a man. So and the B word is used liberally when women are stepping outside of their zone, as well as accusing them of wanting to be men. Okay, so related to this objectification of women, you can see, women as animals. If the way you denigrate a man is by calling him a woman, like a sissy, or even the B word, or whatever else it might be, a wimp, the way that you put a woman into her place, oftentimes what we've noticed in the museum, is by making her into an animal. So Hillary came up again in 2016 with the election, and one of the objects that I really felt strongly about getting into the museum was the KFC Hillary special. And the reason is because not only does it equate Hillary with an animal, so with a chicken, and the chicken stereotype goes way back. That's something when the students and I were doing research on postcards in particular, we saw a lot of postcards that equated women with chickens. So not only is she equated with a chicken here, but she's also being body shamed because of her fat thighs and her small breasts. Left wing, so it's an ideological slam there because she's affiliated with a more left-leaning political party, and she's being consumed, right? Because Kentucky Fried Chicken is what you eat. So and then also the woman on the left-hand side is being reduced to her body parts. And then the bumper sticker, 9 out of 10 women are battered and I'm still eating mine plain, is a connection between violence against women as well as women as food The B word is one, I remember I mentioned that the club woman was probably one of the oldest objects we had in the museum. Well, probably the oldest idea we have in the museum would be the B word. It actually, the word goes back to the medieval period, and it's still alive and well. And when I said that earlier, that the museum is intergenerational, I thought that the B word was, something that we decided as second wave feminism that it was problematic. Joanne Freeman, of course, wrote the Bitch Manifesto, but we're noticing that the valence of the B word changes depending upon who's using it with whom. I oftentimes ask the students, if that word is being used, if a man calls another man that word, what does it mean? Versus a woman referring to another woman by that word. And I've actually learned from our students that the term of endearment now, that they will refer to each other using that word for solidarity purposes. So we're finding that the B word actually has some interesting parallels with the N word. So if women use that word with other women, it's okay, socially acceptable, but that it changes with a man calling a woman that, or a man calling a man that. So there's oftentimes, if we have a quiet group in the museum, we can get a really good conversation going around this case, because it's one of those words that's still being used, and it's understood by different groups in different ways. And now I'm going to move on to anti-feminism, and you'll see here again the club woman. So that's an anti-feminist message from the first wave. Most everything else here is related to second wave feminism. Somebody asked me earlier, what does that, when we were doing a trial run, what does that tie say? It has women's lib with a thumbs down. So that would be a tie that a man would wear if he was not supportive of second wave feminism, so equal rights. So if you look at first wave feminism being related to women gaining the right to vote, second wave was related to women gaining equal rights. And here are some related to the silencing women case. So these are some of the same images we saw before, but then I also tied in some other anti-suffrage objects in there. So if you remember when I said that women were seen as deranged or dangerous if they wanted to leave the home environment. So you can see here at the top, it says the home or the street corner for women, which do you prefer? So a woman who's a proper woman will stay home with her child, whereas the woman on the right-hand side is a crazy suffragist who is mentally unstable and will end up on a street corner without the protective family environment. And then you can see beneath that poster, so that is an anti-suffrage message from first wave feminism. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. So again, what happens when a woman wants to advocate for herself? She neglects her family. So the question I'll ask, this is from a historical perspective, where does it come from? Like why has sexism been a problem that has faced the women since essentially the beginning of the agricultural revolution? And if you go back to the the founders of Western thought, so if you look at Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, you can see that they laid the foundation in Western civilization for the idea that men are superior to women, the idea that men rule and that women are the subjects to male rulers. And so that comes from Aristotle from the Greek perspective, and then Thomas Aquinas is one of the church fathers. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with women who need to be, and that's why we see what our museum can do, which is use all these different objects to show the way women are seen as needing to be put in their place. So a woman needs to be controlled. How to control wild animals, you can see that one. I want to be a homemaker, related to the games we play case. The woman at the bottom left-hand corner is a human Barbie, Valeria Lukhanova. So I put her next to the plastic surgery implements. There's another object we have, Bake the Perfect Woman. So again, it looks like 1950s, but it's actually a fairly recent object. So magically in great shape. So she, there's no problem. She's been working out. She has the perfect body. She's happy to please her husband or her man. She never judges or criticizes. So she's silent when necessary. She loves making gluten-free meals. So she's very attentive to everybody's needs. And she's perfect. She does it all perfectly. So you can see how that object in particular connects with so many of the different cases. And you'll notice under how to control wild animals, that case, well, that object relates to the women as animals case, also to women of color, and also to silencing, right? Because that's what it's about. And the perfect date objects that you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, there's some stereotypes there about women spending men's money, talking about breasts being perfect. So the idea that women need to be perfect and need to be silent, they need to be under control. And a lot of these objects are very recent. So it's not just history we're talking about. These are things that are coming up in our culture, every day. I go to Aldi, I go to the McCostin Medical Center, and I find these messages on people's bumpers. And I take pictures of them. Okay, so the beat goes on. We have some objects in the museum related to Sarah Palin in particular, but the most recent example that we have found of basically attacking a woman for stepping out of her line, stepping out of her zone, would be Hillary running for president in 2016. We found so many objects related to it. And what I thought was interesting from a historical perspective was how this whole repeal the 19th Amendment movement came out at the same time. So here we are in 2020, 100th year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and to see messaging like this, 4 years ago was really eye-opening to me. I mean, here I am working in the museum, so I deal with these objects all the time, and I basically thought, I can't believe I'm seeing this. You can say it's a joke, but I don't think anything's ever just a joke. So these repeal the 19th Amendment messages were buttons, bumper stickers, and also license plate holders. So, but the story isn't over. This is not necessarily a juggernaut that cannot be resisted. And I think that leads to what can our museum do in terms of activism? I know that some of, Deb was telling me that after she came to the museum, she was feeling depressed. Well, we see it, we watch it, we reflect back to society what's around, but there's also a lot of resistance out there. When I was in DC a couple years ago, I took a picture of these two young men with this sign, and I thought, I need to document this too. It's not just about negative messaging, it's also about women and their allies, standing up for themselves. Okay, so I'll stop with that part of my presentation.
So Tracy, did you want people to ask questions at this point? I did have it in the chat that they could send them through the chat, and I haven't received any. But if somebody wants to ask a question, they can click on the participants button at the bottom and they'll find a raise your hand feature. And if you raise your hand, then I can open your mic.
Sure, I'll take some questions now and then we can move on to the next one.
Okay, so Deb has a question.
Of course she does. I was just curious, Tracy, if you could basically review, is it 3 waves of feminism and when was each one, and what we know it by? And
okay, yeah, that's actually my next presentation.
Oh, all right, then we'll wait till we get to that.
Any other questions about the museum itself? We can always wait till the end too.
Okay. I did have one question come in by email, and that was related to the title of the presentation, Off the Pedestal and Out to the Streets. And somebody who is home isolated right now was feeling like maybe we should have changed the title. Did you want to comment on that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I feel really frustrated, I think like everyone else does, that we're not able to get out and speak. But we do have all of these, electronic ways. We can sign petitions electronically. We can connect on Zoom and keep the conversations going. So yeah, I mean, the street can just be a metaphor for now. We'll get out on the actual streets soon enough.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I don't see any other hands going up, and I don't have any in the chat.
Okay, I'm gonna turn off Bada Bing because it's kind of bright. Okay, so I'm going to screen share the next presentation.
Okay.
So yeah, definitely think of the question, 100 years later, how far have we come? And we'll talk about that in the discussion, as well as, what do you think as AAUW Michigan, what are we missing from this museum? What do we need to add more? What else do we need to add to it?
Okay, and while they're thinking about that, we do have one question that came into the chat, and that is, what kind of reaction do men give who tour your museum?
That is an excellent question. We actually created a tutorial because we had a problem with defensive reactions from men. What we try to do is explain to the men who come to the museum that they're caught up in this whole web of sexism, same as women, that men are actually hurt by sexism almost to the same extent as women because of the gender binary. There's expectations that society places upon men, that they have to be the breadwinners, that they can't cry, that they can't. So men are not able to express their full humanity within a sexist society, to this very similarly to how women can't express their full humanity. In other words, if a woman wants to stay home and raise her kids, there's very little flack that she takes for that. Whereas if a man decides he wants to stay home and raise his kids, he oftentimes gets made fun of by the other parents, even in the, at the parks. So anyways, yeah, it's a problem for society. It's a social ill that we all have to endure if we don't confront it and, talk about it and, mostly talk about it and figure out what we can do about it. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen now for my next presentation. Can you see it?
We can.
Excellent. So yes, there's my title. Multi-generational perspective on the waves of feminism. When Deb and I were first talking about a presentation, the second part of it wasn't until I wrote my intro that I realized I need to talk about multi-generational perspectives.
And Jan wants to know how this works with the students.
Oh, what we do, yes. With the students, we have to be careful. The professors and students who facilitate pay really close attention to body language. And we oftentimes also give a trigger warning and say, if you are feeling uneasy, feel free to step out of the museum. And there's actually been a couple of instances where people have had to leave the museum, mostly women, but I can tell men are often triggered as well. But mostly for them, it's they feel like they're being attacked or they feel like they need to be defensive. So what we did in order to minimize that was we created a tutorial to introduce the students to the ideas, like how does sexism work in our society, using really objective language, academic language, so that they could have their own framework for understanding what was in the museum. And when they come in too, I always talk about maybe what your research project is, so that they're not taking it personally, they're looking at it more objectively. But yeah, it can be hard not to be defensive in the museum, especially if you're a man. I find that the people who are the most moved by the museum are fathers of daughters, because they really didn't see how sexism works in society until they had a daughter that they love very much, and they see how their daughter is being affected by sexism. I find that they are sometimes the most fierce critics and most outspoken visitors to the museum. So, and actually I found the same thing when I teach my global women's activism class. I think a lot of women were used to sexism. You know, a lot of times it just rolls right off our back and we try not to even let it affect us. But because men aren't as attuned to it, when they spend 15 weeks of a semester studying it, they can become, frankly, you know, once they get over maybe a wave of defensiveness, which is natural, they become really angry and upset, and they become activists. One of my students was a race car driver and went on to teach mechanical engineering at a high school. So he taught basically like a shop that focused on cars around Lansing, and he became a fierce advocate for female students. Another student, very, very conservative, former Marine. He's still extremely so conservative that he, and critical of and sexist, actually, let's just say he was actually full on sexist, that he was actually harassing a lot of the students in class, and they kind of had to learn how to put up with him. And I tried to make sure he felt like he was being listened to, but at the same time tried to tell him to cool it. Well, he actually communicates with me very, very regularly now about all the different sexism he finds around him and how he's fighting it. So yeah, you know, we kind of have to see this as we're all on a journey. We're all caught up in sexism. I am, my mother is, my mother, you know, who inspired me to go in this direction, oftentimes says to me, Tracy, why do you care so much about women? Like, why is this an obsession of yours? And it's because of her, but she, you know, it's just one of those things where there's only so much you can take at once. There's only, you know, so much you can take, even being in this museum. When my student workers are in here, I say, you can leave, you know, you don't have to do all your work in the museum. You can step out and go to the library to do your research, because it just can be very overwhelming. Okay, so let's go into the waves of feminism. Perfect question is my next slide. Okay, so first wave would be suffrage, the suffrage movement. So women fighting to gain the right to vote. You can argue that this wave began with the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, and that it ended in 1920 when the women were granted finally the right to vote. Second wave is the Equal Rights Amendment wave. Women did not succeed in getting an equal rights amendment. However, a lot of gains were made for them during this era from a legal perspective. So it was focusing on civil rights. The third wave is, you know, there's a lot of debate about the third wave. Most people will say it started in the 1990s. One thing you can certainly say, regardless of when it began or whether it's still going on, is that it's intersectional. So I included this picture of a young woman displaying or demonstrating just how, just what this means in terms of intersectionality. It means finally listening to women of color more fully. It means disabled women, Native American women, immigrant women, queer women, and sexual assault survivors. Some of these groups have been, you know, not really a part of the narrative for the first wave or the second wave. First wave feminists was mostly white women. Second wave feminism, also mostly white women. Third wave is trying to be more inclusive. There's another aspect to this third wave that I wanted to bring up, which is intergenerational. This picture is from the Women's March in 2017. So this shows an older woman giving, she made this, the pussy hat's kind of a non-traditional one. She had an old sweater that she cut up and made one from scratch, and she made two. So she was looking for someone to give the second hat to, and she gave it to my daughter, who's there looking up at her. So I felt like this Women's March in 2017 was incredibly intergenerational, and a lot of, I feel like, what's been happening in the museum since 2016 to 2017 in the Me Too movement has also been intergenerational. I'd say before Me Too, a lot of the women who came to the museum would think of feminism as the F word. In other words, they would never identify as feminists. I think, though, that there was a major switch that happened with the Me Too movement, and now feminism is something that doesn't have the stigma that it had. I'm not sure exactly what happened after second wave feminism, but it was the 80s and feminism became a bad word. And that's something we can talk about during the questions and answer period too. Okay, and so another way to illustrate these three waves is right here. So then and now, you can see the women standing in front of the White House. That's, you know, the women's party under Alice Paul. They took to direct action by putting pressure on Woodrow Wilson directly, which was a different strategy than the MoSO had. Shoulder to shoulder into the fray. You can see these are women in the 21st century dressing up like suffragists, so third wave women. And then the second wave women down here marching with the text for the Equal Rights Amendment. And then another, I think, new aspect, although not really new, is the he for she, because women had advocates, certainly during first wave and second wave. And then it was, you know, Emma Watson and the United Nations promoting that, you know, this is something for everyone. Basically, all these women movements are for liberating all of humanity, not just women from gendered expectations. So this is my husband, my daughters, and me in 2017. And the reason I put this in here, this one in particular, is because it also shows the intergenerational, because you have the woman there in the background that says, now you've pissed off grandma. Okay, so I called the presentation Off of the Pedestal and Onto the Streets. And there are a number of pedestals that women have been put on, and it looks like a good place, right? Women represent justice, women represent beauty and love, the Venus, or liberty in terms of the Statue of Liberty. But these are idealized women. What happens when real women want to speak and stand up for their rights? Well, if you look at what happens after the creation of our country, if we're looking at the history of the United States, there was this idea that women were important to what was called at the time Republican virtue. So creating a new society in which everyone knew, children in particular, knew how to be good citizens. And in order to do that, the mother played a central role in the house. So, but the reason this is significant is because it gave women the window into becoming educated, right? So interesting just how timely this is today, right? In terms of COVID, you know, how women are, and men too, husbands and wives with children are having to educate their kids at home. But, you know, before the creation of the public school system, you know, and education was a very important concept in the early period of the United States. As a matter of fact, education literacy was highest in the United States for pretty much the whole part of throughout the 19th century, due to the efforts of the Republican mothers and later the public school system. So women were able to use this idea of Republican motherhood to say, well, we created this new society with these new citizens based upon the idea that all men are created equal. And then, you know, 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton changed the Declaration of Independence to include women. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And if you remember when I said that, you know, primarily early on, the first wave feminists, it was primarily a white women's movement. Actually, there were quite a few African American women too, but as the various the national women's suffrage organizations and the American women's suffrage, as they went out to the states to advocate for equal suffrage, they had to deal with the fact that the southern states were very much afraid of giving equal voting rights to the Black women. So they had to play a very delicate dance with their message Okay. So this is the key here is citizenship. And that was where the suffrage movement was able to finally gain traction. If women pay taxes, then, and if women obey the laws, then women should be able to vote. And the reason that there was resistance to this was because of this Old English idea of the woman who is covered. So femme curate. And the idea was that women were, there was a master of the family who was the husband, the woman was the subject, and related anything outside of the home, the man would represent the family. So that was something that the suffragists had to work against. So they used whatever they could to try past that expectation. So women pay taxes, no taxation without representation. Government by the people, for the people. Who are the people? Are women people too? A fundamental question. It's not something we think about much today, but it was a real issue back then. And then you see a very early on, he for she here, men of New Jersey be just, vote yes on women's suffrage. And if you look at the memoirs of Anna Howard Shaw, you can see that a lot of what she does when you read her autobiography is she's traveling around the country and giving speeches and trying to convince people that women are intellectually equal to men, that they have more, they're morally equal, intellectually equal, that they have equal, that they're worthy of equal rights. But she, because she was not a wealthy person, she was an immigrant from Great Britain. Her family basically faced bankruptcy, came to the US for a fresh start. They moved to Michigan, her family moved to Michigan. Actually, the father and the older sons left. The mother and Anna Howard Shaw and her one older brother to fend for themselves when Anna was just 12 years old in a very cold and kind of brutal Michigan winter environment. Those of us in Michigan know how winter can be. So she became radicalized by this experience and always had a very strong heart for women who were working class women. And so this is one of the quotes I wanted to put in related to her. Around me, I saw women overworked and underpaid, doing men's work at half men's wages, not because their work was inferior, but because they were women. So I feel like that was that gave a lot of traction to the movement too. The idea that women were supporting their families. They were being oftentimes left by husbands who are not doing their husbandly duty. She was also, a lot of the women who were suffragists were also fighting for temperance. So they wanted to outlaw alcohol because they saw that alcohol was crippling women because the men were not able to work, and they were drinking and taking maybe all the family resources and abandoning their wives and abandoning their children. So there should be justice for these women. And so she was very good at portraying why women needed full citizenship in order to be protected. So the husband wasn't always able to do that job, so women should be able to do that job for their families. So what's interesting here is that and this will come up when we talk about the ERA, there's a split in the women's movement. There's the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded by Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Later on, it's Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt, who run it. So they pretty much start a whole state by state, like they're going to get suffrage through one state after the other, versus the Women's Party methods, which were orchestrated by Alice Paul. Alice Paul took more radical measures of basically standing in front of the White House, being arrested, and once being arrested, going on hunger strikes. While on hunger strikes, she would be force-fed. So this all got a lot of press, And this was all happening during during World War I. So because this was during World War I and women were making so many sacrifices for the country during World War I, you could argue, well, how was victory achieved? Part of it was this message of women are the voters. Women are bringing voters into the world, so they should vote. They're the mothers, so harking back to Republican motherhood. Women need to protect their children, so they need citizenship rights. But also this direct action taken by Alice Paul, and we see them standing there today and we think, oh, these are our heroes. At the time, they were seen as radicals. They would be, if they were out in the streets marching for themselves, they could be yelled at, go back to your home, go take care of your children. This is not what real women should do. So, if you see the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, the argument will be made, that Alice Paul was the soul, that she was the force behind this success. But I think to just look at these petitioners standing in front of the White House and getting in Woodrow Wilson's face, you can't just look at that as the reason for success. Alice Paul was one way to go about it. Anna Howard Shaw, by going and meeting with people all over the country, Susan B. Anthony, that also laid the groundwork for ultimate victory with the 19th Amendment. But we can't get too excited because Alice Paul realized very early on that the right to vote was not enough. So she begins the battle for the ERA already in 1923. So if you look at how long it took women to gain the right to vote, 1848 to 1920, that's 72 years. If you look at how long it took women to gain an Equal Rights Amendment, if you see it starting in 1923, then we have a situation where it still has not been achieved today. So she took up the banner for equal rights immediately. And this was something that she was more aligned with the Republican Party. The Republican Party did tend to be more pro-women's suffrage, pro-temperance, and later on during the 20th century, pro-Equal Rights Amendment. So she submitted before Congress pretty much every year the Lucretia Mott Amendment. So her amendment was men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and in every place subject to its jurisdiction. So for 20 years, this was not passed, but certainly put forth to Congress. So the Republican Party tended to support the ERA. The Democrats resisted. I ask why, and the reason, the short form answer is because the Democrats tended to be more of a working class oriented party, and they were worried that if women were given equal rights with men, that women would lose their workplace protections. So that was the number one. Even Eleanor Roosevelt was not supportive of the ERA for that reason. So from 1943 to 1972, women in Congress and their male supporters continued to put forth an Equal Rights Amendment. And this is the one that we know very well because it's the one that's still up for to be approved and to be that was sent around to all the states for ratification, but it didn't quite make it. So equality of rights under law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So you can see women are marching, second wave, marching in the streets for this. Was it achieved? They got very close. In 1972, the logjam breaks, and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both have the ERA as a part of their platforms, the party platforms. So a lot of momentum is gaining. In 1 year, 22 states ratify the ERA. So it passes Congress, it goes to the states for ratification, blistering speed, very successful. It looks like it's going to happen. But then something happens. The last 3 states the ratification process grinds to a halt. A lot of the credit can be given to Phyllis Schlafly for this. She also is in the streets. She's in front of the White House, and she's very concerned about women losing their protections, not so much working class women, but women losing their right to, for example, Social Security, if they're housewives, for example. One of the big issues was selective service. Could women be drafted? And you know, I just celebrated my half century last year. I turned 50, and I remember this very, very clearly. And I also remember saying to people, if there's a war, you know, why should I be excluded? So, but I think there was this idea that girls shouldn't have to, young women shouldn't have to go and fight our battles. So I think that's where she gained a lot of her traction. And what I want to show you here is a comparison of the anti-suffrage propaganda with the anti-ERA propaganda. So remember how I talked about the F word and how feminism had a really negative reputation, you know, for the women who came to the museum. They said, I am not, you know, I see the problem, but I'm not a feminist. So you can see here, feminism was portrayed as encouraging women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, right, and become lesbians. So you can see homophobia, you know, destroying capital. So the American way of life. Feminism is going to destroy everything that makes our country great. And this was, you know, definitely a part of the Stop ERA message. But you can see a similarity here with the procession of suffragists, down with men and up with women. So the idea that feminists want to take over, that feminists want to be better than men, not equal to men. So yeah, that was part of the negative baggage that went with the suffrage movement. And then here, back to the same message that we were talked about already. If she's out on the streets, if a woman's on the streets, she's neglecting her kids, right? You see the same thing over here. The appeal of womanhood, no votes, you know, a woman, you know, who's running around on the streets is not a true woman, not a proper woman. And here you can see, don't foxhole American women, stop the ERA. So the idea that you don't want to send women onto the front lines of combat. Today, you know, it's happened, you know, women are on the front lines, but back in the 70s, that was a horrifying thought for many people. Okay, so the Republican Party, certainly a vanguard for the suffragists, especially when Alice Paul formed the National Women's Party. Anna Howard Shaw tried to work with both parties, but the Republicans really become the party that moves forward women's issues in the 20th century, but it's removed from the Republican platform in the year that Reagan is elected in 1980. Okay, so skipping between 1980 and 2011, most women, because a lot of laws did pass, especially during those periods of the 20th century when the Democrats weren't going for the ERA, a lot of laws were passed still that gave more equality to women and more guarantees of equality for women. Non-discrimination in federal jobs, for example, was enshrined in law. So it got to the point where most Americans began to believe, A, that the ERA had passed when it hadn't, and B, that men and women were legally equal. But then in 2011, I think this was a real breakthrough moment. And a movie was made as a result of this called Equal Means Equal that basically developed momentum again for the ERA. When Scalia said about the Constitution that it does not require discrimination on the basis of sex, the only issue is whether it prohibits it, and he said it does not. So in other words, women are not protected under the Constitution, or at least the Supreme Court can come to that conclusion. So I think this is what spurred a whole new movement for the ERA. And just these past few years, we've noticed that Okay, we're three states shy, right? Nevada passed it, Illinois, Virginia in 2020. The question is now, has it passed? Can it become law? It was the statute of limitations. The deadline, the 1982 ERA deadline was removed by Congress on February 13th, 2020, but that's the House of Representatives. It would have to pass through the Senate too for that to happen. Probably not going to happen. So anyways, I'm going to end with this question. Why is it taking over 96 years to get an equal rights amendment? Okay, so I'll stop with that. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Tracy. Again, if there are a few questions, we are a little bit over time, but I do want to honor anybody who has some questions that they would like to ask. So if you have a question, type it into the chat or use the raise your hand function so that I can call on you. Well, I'm not seeing anything coming in. Tracy, that was a fabulous presentation. Oh, wait a minute, here comes something. What do you think the chance of getting this passed is? So what is the chance of ERA being passed, given that we went past the time limit and all of that?
There's my last slide. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the most foremost proponents of getting the ERA passed, said on February 15th of this year, I would like to see a new beginning. I'd like it to start over, simply because of the fact that 1982 is a long period separated from 2020. I'm sure people who support the ERA don't want to have to go through all those stages again, all those steps again. But there's also the problem of 3 of the states who passed the ERA, and remember that whirlwind passing 22 states in 1 year, rescinded their ratification of the ERA. So legally, what does that mean, that they rescinded their ratification? So in other words, it could get tied up in courts. Even if those last 3 states, of course those count, maybe, right, if the deadline can be extended. But what about those states that rescinded their votes?
Okay, we have another question, and that is, why are the southern states not ratifying the ERA?
I think a lot of that comes down to the party situation, right? With the Republican Party becoming more of a Southern party, and with the ERA becoming political, it's just one political party or another political party. It's going to. So I think it's a political question.
Okay, and I think you already answered the next question that's there about the forecast for this ERA confirmation. It's anybody's guess. I'm going to turn the floor over to our president, Deb Kennedy.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Tracy. I just wanted to comment that Tracy was to be our speaker tomorrow night in Midland to kick off our state convention. And so, Tracy, we certainly appreciate not only you being willing to come to Midland, but then broadcast from the museum, I think added a lot. We have already a lot of positive comments. Thanks, excellent presentation, informative and interesting. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Tracy. We appreciate your sisterhood and being in our tribe, and as you phrased it in one of your pieces, we are comrades in arms, and we will fight till this is achieved. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you all, and have a good evening.
Are there any questions from those who've remained?
I can unmute everybody at this point.
Like giving me pieces at a time. So, okay.
Oh, I'm not on. Oh, here we go.
This and this.
Okay, the last of you who are on, it's unmuted.
And then when I fix that, they review that, and then they tell me a little bit more about other slides they want to change.
Sheila, we hear you.
They're not doing it the right way. They're not going through the entire thing and telling me about all the changes they want to make. They're just going through a few slides at a time. It makes no sense.
Tracy, that was really fabulous. Thank you so much for doing that.
Oh, no problem. It's so hard though, without having eye contact with my audience. It was not great from my perspective.
I know when I have had to serve in that capacity, when you are in front of an audience, you have so much feedback. You know how you're being taken. And when you're talking to a bunch of muted people, it really changes the dynamic.
It really does. It really does.
It was excellent. Very interesting, very informative. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And no other questions? I mean, I was hoping to get your generational perspective. I know a lot of you are,
I'm old.
second wave, you are second wave feminists, right? You were in the streets. I was toddling around when you were in the streets. So I wanted to learn from you as much as
Oh,
learn from me.
that's true, because when I married, there was no women's movement or anything like that. It didn't come about till about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years later that it very, very started. I used to say to my husband, I reneged on you. I want to go to work, and I know you're doing everything you agreed you would do, being a good provider, but times have changed. It was very, very different.
And I'm about 5 to 10 years too young for second wave. I remember Alice Doesn't Day and everybody just making this huge, turning it into a mockery. And Alice Doesn't Day was this day when all the women were supposed to say, I'm not doing anything today, to show just how much work women put in. Well, I was still in high school. I was a sophomore. So I was, just that much too young, and it turned into a mockery instead of the kind of show display of what women really do that it was intended to be. And things just petered out after that. So I'm in college trying to be a feminist, and everybody is looking at me like I got an antler growing out of my head. What do you mean? We don't have any problems. Nobody ever stopped me from going to college. What's your problem? So
yeah, you're absolutely right.
May I ask, what's the deal about the museum? Is it open to the public?
Oh, absolutely. All
Hours?
you have to do is, well, it's open by appointment. All you do is send me an email and let me know when you want to come in. And as long as I'm not teaching a class, I'll take you around.
I see. Thank you.
except not right now.
No, not right now.
Yeah. Actually, even right now, if you want to wear a mask, I'll come.
All right.
I'm desperate for human interaction.
True.
I need a haircut.
Yeah, don't we all, Polly?
My daughter cut my hair the other day.
I cut my own.
You all are talented. I can't do that. So mine's just getting shaggier and shaggier.
I didn't say she gave me a good haircut, but she gave me a haircut.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was really a great presentation.
Oh, good. Thank you for coming. And I hope that you can all come to see the museum. Maybe not all at once because it's a small space, but different AAUWs can come by, make little pilgrimages up here to Big Rapids. The place
That'd be
where Howard
great.
Shaw lived for her, girlhood, young girlhood and womanhood.
Yeah.
Okay.
A pilgrimage is in I saw people from Traverse City, Grosse Pointe, Lansing. It's not that far away.
No, not really.
No. Except that we haven't driven in so long, we're going to have to learn how to drive again.
Yeah.
What do you mean? I drive to the grocery store at least twice a week.
I just do I order online and all those things. I don't want to get it.
Yeah.
So, okay, thank you. I'm going to leave, and we haven't eaten yet, and I haven't started dinner even.
We haven't
Thanks
either.
a lot.
So.
Okay.
I'm going
Bye-bye.
to end the meeting for everyone. Thanks so much, Tracy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.